mentioned in my previous segment on Benjamin Franklin that a very famous European philosopher called Franklin America's first philosopher. This is the second in a series of programs I'm doing on Benjamin Franklin. And my emphasis is on Franklin the practical philosopher and not on Franklin the founding father. First, a brief review of some of the points I made in my last program on Franklin. I mentioned that Franklin's very famous autobiography expresses much of his philosophy. He points out, for example, in his autobiography, that when he was in his early 20s, he formulated a self-improvement program. And he said that he wanted to concentrate on cultivating 13 virtues. Among the virtues he writes about are the following. He says he wanted to develop temperance. He wanted to develop an Aristotelian moderation, for example, concerning eating and drinking. And he says this: eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. The idea is we shouldn't consume as much as we want, but rather we should consume as much as good for us. Another virtue Franklin was interested in cultivating was that of industry. He wanted to use his time wisely. And he says this: lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Franklin goes on to point out that, in his opinion, laziness is not the path to greater fulfillment in living, but rather, again, using one's time wisely. A third virtue he said he wanted to develop was that of justice. And by justice, Franklin means treating other people fairly. He says this in his autobiography: wrong none by doing injuries to others. But he goes on to say that it's not enough to simply avoid hurting others. It's very important that we help others when we have the ability to do so. Indeed, Franklin believed we have a duty to help other people when we can. And on this subject of living usefully, Franklin said this: when I die, I would rather have it said that he lived usefully than that he died rich. A fourth virtue, and the last one I'll be talking about today concerning the review of the last program, is that of tranquility. Franklin said he wanted to cultivate tranquility, and he indicated that one way to do that is not to sweat the small stuff. Of course, that's the current terminology. Franklin did not use those words. He said this: be not disturbed at trifles or at accidents, common or unavoidable. The idea is that unpleasant things happen to all of us. It's an inevitable part of everyone's life. And the idea is that we have to learn to accept certain inconveniences and accidents, as he says, certain unavoidable accidents in life. Today I'd like to begin with the last virtue that Franklin talks about in his autobiography. It's the virtue he labels humility. And in this particular section of his book, he says that it was his desire to imitate Jesus and Socrates. Interesting, by the way, that Socrates lived 400 years before Jesus. And one might wonder, well, how were Jesus and Socrates alike? Because Franklin did see them in many ways being similar. Well, among the ways Socrates and Jesus were alike are the following. Both tried to wake up people as to what's really important in life. Both Socrates and Jesus said we should be more interested in keeping our souls clean than in accumulating money and status and power. Indeed, Franklin had a pretty interesting viewpoint concerning wealth, even though he himself became a rather wealthy man. Yale professor Edmund Morgan, who has written what is probably the best short biography on Franklin, talks about Franklin's attitude towards wealth and says this, and I'm quoting Professor Morgan: Franklin would have liked a law to limit the amount of fortune any one person could accumulate. And Walter Isaacson, Franklin's most recent biographer, who, by the way, has written a splendid biography, a very thorough biography of Franklin. Walter Isaacson put it this way. He says that Franklin defended high taxes, especially on luxury items. Socrates, Jesus, and Franklin all believed it is in our selfish interest to be humble. I think the book of Proverbs reflects their thinking, and perhaps you're familiar with this passage in the book of Proverbs. Pride goes before ruin, arrogance before failure. And Jesus, in the New Testament, is quoted as saying the following: "Those who humble themselves will be exalted, and those who exalt themselves will be humbled." Franklin confesses in his autobiography that he had certain serious problems in cultivating some of the virtues. For example, chastity. Franklin mentions in his autobiography that he had frequent intrigues with low women, and he said he often worried about the money he was spending on such escapades, as well as the risks to his health. And he explains it this way. He explains his reason for doing this in the following way. He says, inclination was sometimes too strong for reason. Again, Franklin's own words. Inclination was sometimes too strong for reason. And as a consequence, he was not able to fulfill his pursuit of certain virtues in the way he wanted to. But he also says this: I concluded that the mere speculative conviction that it is in our interest to be completely virtuous was not sufficient to keep us from slipping. Franklin's comments on his battle to become a more virtuous person reminds me of St. Augustine. St. Augustine, in his very famous autobiography entitled The Confessions of St. Augustine, mentions that, like Franklin, sex was a real problem for him when he was young. Indeed, Augustine, like Franklin, had an illegitimate child when he was young. And Augustine, in his autobiography, says he prayed to God for chastity, and he says this was the essence of the prayer, and I'm quoting St. Augustine: "Give me chastity, but not yet." Franklin raises the question, does being a good person make us happier? Does being a good person make us happier? His answer is yes, and allow me to give you his own words. In his autobiography, he wrote the following: "Though I never arrived at the perfection I had been so ambitious of obtaining, but fell far short of it, yet I was by the endeavor a better and happier man than I otherwise would have been if I had not attempted it." Franklin goes on to say that our evil doing hurts us in this world. Our evil doing hurts us in this world. Again, his own words: "It is therefore everyone's interest to be virtuous who wishes to be happy even in this world." Do you agree with Franklin that being a just and decent person makes us happier in this life? Isn't it true that many people with whom we interact on a daily basis believe that people are suckers who try to be sincere and honest? We've all heard the expression that very wicked people laugh all the way to the bank. And we've all heard the expression, no good deed goes unpunished. No good deed goes unpunished. Think about the fate of some commercial whistleblowers, industrial whistleblowers in our nation's history. Also think about the fate of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi and even Jesus, people fighting for justice, and what was the result for them of fighting for justice. Former baseball manager Leo DeRocha said this: "Nice guys finish last." I know of some unqualified, dishonorable people who got significant job promotions. I also know of some very qualified, honorable people who never got the job promotions. How about yourself? Do you know such people? Well, what do the famous thinkers say about this? Do the famous thinkers, like Franklin, claim that there is a connection between being a good person and a happy person? Well, the majority claim that there is. And the expression so many of them use in one way or another is this: in the long run. In the long run, being a good person will make us happier. They don't deny that in the short run, we might be punished for our good deeds. So many of the famous thinkers claim that if we try hard to be good human beings, that it'll make our old age a more pleasant one. Indeed, it's been said that the softest pillow is a clear conscience. So many of the great thinkers have also said that if we try to be good people, that it will make dying a lot easier. The Buddha talked about karma, the law of consequence. The Buddhists believe that when we do good, we will be rewarded, and when we do evil, we will be punished. And of course, Jesus talked about people gaining the whole world, but losing their souls. The French philosopher Montaigne put it this way: a generous pride accompanies a good conscience. A generous pride accompanies a good conscience. And Aristotle said that only the just person can experience the joy and satisfaction that come with being a just person. And Plato went even beyond Aristotle in this sense. Plato said that the happiest person is the most just person. Plato also said that the unhappiest person is the most wicked person. So the fact of the matter is that a great number of very famous thinkers in literature and philosophy, religion and psychology do agree with Benjamin Franklin that if we try to be decent, kind, just people, that in the long run we will be happier for our efforts. I'd like now to move to another aspect of Franklin's philosophy. Franklin talks a lot about the art of conversation. It's interesting, all of us probably have conversations almost every day, but I wonder how many of us reflect on what our conversations are like and what we might do to make our conversations better, more worthwhile. Franklin, incidentally, was known as a very charming, interesting conversationalist. And when he was in France, and he spent many years in France, he was a frequent guest at what they called salons in France. These were gatherings, very often of people with an intellectual bent, and that people would often like to attend these salons, even if they weren't going to converse with these people, because they wanted to hear their conversations, thinking that their conversations were that worthwhile, that it would be good to eavesdrop on what certain people talk about. H.D.F. Keto, a scholar on ancient Greece, has said this about the art of conversation in ancient Greece. Professor Keto says this: informed and intelligent conversation was regarded as the highest sport in ancient Greece. Again, informed and intelligent conversation was regarded as the highest sport in ancient Greece. Franklin, in his autobiography and other writings, talks about what he considers to be some of the common mistakes people make in conversation. Some mistakes, in fact, that he claims he made as a young man. One of the glaring errors, Franklin says, we often make is being dogmatic in conversation, using expressions like "I'm right," "you're wrong," "that's foolish." Franklin contends that we should avoid such expressions and instead use gentler, kinder phrases, such as, "It seems to me," "I think," "in my opinion," "I believe," "the reason I believe this is." And of course, besides using gentler, kinder language, it's very important that our tone of voice is appropriate. We know that our tone of voice can very much affect people's attitudes towards us in conversation. Occasionally, I will listen to a certain cable TV personality who sometimes tells his guests to shut up. And I often wonder, what are young people, and in fact even older people, learning about how we should converse with each other from watching this man on cable television? Franklin claims that an indispensable element in conversations where people disagree about something is this: we should have an attitude of truth-seeking. One should argue with another person, not to prove that oneself is right, but rather to find out what the truth is. This requires a certain humility, by the way, because it's not unusual, I think, that we have disagreements with people. And again, if we can concentrate on pursuing the truth instead of making the conversation an ego trip where each of us has to be right, the conversation will be more worthwhile. I recall Ralph Waldo Emerson in one of his books commenting on this. And he was talking about his school days and how a teacher should react if a student proves the teacher wrong on some point. Franklin says, and he addresses this to teachers, Franklin says, if one of your pupils proves you wrong on something, what you might do besides congratulating him is go over to him or her and hug the student. What are some other common mistakes people often make in conversation, besides the one I've already alluded to, and that is being assertive in a bullying manner? Well, I think another common mistake we often make is not listening carefully. Listening is a skill. Good teachers, good psychiatrists, good interviewers have this skill. Another mistake I think we often make is talking too much. Franklin claims that one of the more amusing things he sometimes witnessed was observing two very talkative people, neither of whom was a good listener, talking to each other. Also, another possible error, and that is not considering what topic the person we're talking to might be interested in conversing about. If I'm very interested in sports, but I'm talking to someone who's not very interested in sports, it seems to me unfair to attempt to talk about sports in that climate. Also, I'm a rather bookish person, and if I'm talking to someone who's not very interested in reading, again, it seems to me it would be unfair of me to talk about books to such a person, but rather what I should do is to try to talk about a topic I know that person is interested in. Also, another glaring error is nosiness. Nosiness, prying for personal secrets in someone else's life. I think that's a turnoff for anyone in conversation. And also, speaking too much about oneself. I don't think our conversational partners appreciate the idea of any one of us talking too much about ourselves in conversation. And also, a very common error I think people make is exchanging gossip rather than information or ideas. I know that I wish to learn something in conversation. When I converse with someone, I would like to learn, for example, about how another person sees life, people, and the world. I'd like to learn something about nutrition or cooking from somebody else who may know much more about these things than I know. I'd like to know something more about physical fitness. I'm very interested in physical fitness, but my knowledge in this area is quite limited, and I don't doubt that many of the people I speak to know more about this subject than I do, so that in a conversation with them, I want to learn from them. Also, I'm a mechanical klutz. I'm very incompetent when it comes to home maintenance. So if I'm speaking to someone who's very handy around the house, whether the person be a male or a female, I wish to raise that topic in conversation and maybe learn something about home maintenance from them. And finally, in my own conversations, I wish to develop insights about living a more fulfilling life. And if I can talk to someone who can provide me with some valuable insights about living a more joyful, tranquil life, well, then that will make the conversation very worthwhile. What kind of person might be the ideal conversationalist? Again, what might be the character traits of the ideal conversationalist? Well, it seems to me that good conversationalists, generally speaking, are kind, warm-hearted people. They're also thoughtful people. They are people who have cultivated the skill of critical thinking. They see through political propaganda. They see through advertising propaganda. And they see through so much of the silliness in the typical television program. And also they see through sports propaganda. That's right, I think there is much propaganda concerning sports in America. Another characteristic of good conversationalists, I think, is that they are generally humble people. They realize that there are few things about which we can be certain in life. They realize that there are very few things about which we can be certain in life. And finally, I think very good conversationalists are very sincere people. Indeed, Thoreau put it this way. Thoreau said this: "Man's noblest gift to man is his sincerity. Man's noblest gift to man is his sincerity." Humanitarian Albert Schweitzer, one of my favorite people. You probably know he was a medical doctor, a European medical doctor, who went to Africa to treat the poorest of the poor for more than 30 years. Schweitzer, by the way, besides being a medical doctor, had a PhD in philosophy and also had been a concert organist in Europe. Why am I mentioning Schweitzer in this segment on conversation? Well, because Albert Schweitzer, in his writings, talks about the frustrations of conversing with people who are not interested in having good conversations. And he says this, and I'm quoting Dr. Albert Schweitzer: "How much I suffer from the way we spend so much of our time uselessly in conversation, instead of talking in serious fashion about serious things and getting to know each other, and getting to know each other well as hoping and believing, striving and suffering mortals. I often feel it to be absolutely wrong to sit like that with a mask on." So that Schweitzer, like Thoreau, laments the lack of sincerity in many conversations. And by the way, he also is accusing himself of lack of sincerity at times in conversation. He talks about his own mask wearing. And I think it's fair to say that if we are going to have good conversations with other people, therapeutic, worthwhile conversations with other people, it's very important that we try to be genuine. It's very important that we try to remove the mask. Schweitzer not only laments mask wearing in conversation, but also laments the idea that we don't get to know each other in any significant way. We don't get to know each other in any significant way. Are most conversations just a lot of noise? What do you think? Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, contends that he thinks that very often there is a connection between reading and good conversation. Franklin claims that one of the reasons that perhaps he was sought out as a conversational mate was because of all the reading he had done in his life, reading which very much enriched his intellectual life. In fact, Franklin points out in his book that from the time of his childhood, his favorite hobby was reading. Franklin, incidentally, was self-educated. Benjamin Franklin, like Abraham Lincoln, only had about 2 years of formal education. Perhaps you have heard of Franklin being referred to as Doctor. So often in some of the recent television presentations of Benjamin Franklin's life, or in newspaper articles, he's referred to as Dr. Franklin. Well, as I said, he only had 2 years of formal education, but he was awarded honorary doctorate degrees by many universities. In fact, among the universities that conferred an honorary doctorate on Franklin was St. Andrews University in Scotland, Oxford in England, and Harvard and Yale in the United States. Another topic that I wish to pursue concerning Franklin and his autobiography and his personal philosophy concerns Franklin's attitude towards religion. And since I'm running a little short on time, let me just make some brief comments about Franklin's philosophy towards religion, and in my next program, I'll pursue this theme at greater length. Franklin talked about the best service we can render to God, and here's what he said. The best service to God is doing good to men. Those are his own words. The best service to God is doing good to men. Some basic facts about Franklin and his religious life, so to speak. Franklin rarely went to church, but he said he did believe in the existence of God. And incidentally, Franklin, when he accumulated a lot of money in middle age, contributed money to the building of many churches in Philadelphia, and indeed also contributed to the building of a synagogue in Philadelphia. Next week, again, I'll have more to say about Franklin's attitude towards religion. Right now, what I'd like to do is to recommend some books that you might be interested in reading that provide further illumination on Franklin. Again, I suggest you start with his autobiography, one of the most famous autobiographies ever written. But two great biographies of Franklin are the following. A book entitled Benjamin Franklin, A Life by Walter Isaacson. It's the most recent biography of Franklin, again by Walter Isaacson. And again, a great short biography of Benjamin Franklin, entitled Benjamin Franklin by Yale professor Edmund Morgan. And finally, I'd like to close with a reminder from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau in Walden tells us that we are all artists. Thoreau wrote the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."